22 orphan boys, aged 3 to 10, board a Spanish ship in 1803. They have no idea they're about to become living vaccine carriers in the most ambitious medical expedition in history. One by one, they'll be infected with cowpox, their arms swelling with pus that will save thousands of lives across 3 continents. For the next 3 years, these children will sail around the world, passing a life-saving vaccine from arm to arm, child to child, in a human chain that reached from Spain to China. This is the true story of how the Spanish Empire used orphans to defeat smallpox, and why this medical triumph would be considered child abuse today. In 1803, smallpox was humanity's greatest killer. The disease had ravaged Europe for centuries, leaving millions dead and survivors permanently scarred. Entire villages would be wiped out in weeks, with mortality rates reaching 90% in some outbreaks. Children were particularly vulnerable, and those lucky enough to survive often bore the distinctive pockmarks that marked them as survivors for life. The terror of smallpox reached even the highest levels of society. King Charles IV of Spain watched helplessly as the disease claimed his own daughter, making the fight against smallpox deeply personal for the Spanish monarch. When Edward Jenner's revolutionary cowpox vaccine was discovered in 1796, it offered hope for the first time in human history. Jenner had observed that milkmaids who caught cowpox from cattle seemed immune to smallpox, leading him to develop the world's first vaccine. The Spanish Empire stretched across the globe, from the Philippines to Mexico to South America. Millions of Spanish subjects lived in these distant colonies, all vulnerable to smallpox outbreaks that could devastate entire populations. King Charles IV decided that the vaccine must reach every corner of his empire, no matter the cost or complexity involved. The challenge seemed impossible. In 1803, there was no refrigeration, no way to preserve biological materials during long sea voyages. The cowpox vaccine consisted of live material that would lose its potency within days of being harvested. A journey from Spain to the Americas could take months, and reaching the Philippines might require half a year or more. By the time ships arrived at their destinations, any vaccine they carried would be useless. Francisco Javier de Balmis, the royal physician, proposed a solution that was as brilliant as it was controversial. Instead of trying to preserve the vaccine in vials or containers, he would create a living chain of vaccination. Children would serve as human carriers, their bodies keeping the vaccine alive during the long journey across the oceans. The plan required a steady supply of children who had never been exposed to smallpox or cowpox. Balmis turned to Spain's orphanages, recruiting 22 boys between the ages of 3 and 10. These children came from the poorest families in Spanish society, many abandoned at birth or orphaned by disease and poverty. Their parents, if still alive, had little choice but to agree when government officials requested their children for this unprecedented mission. The logistics were carefully planned. Every 10 days, one child would be vaccinated with material taken from the previous carrier's arm. The cowpox would develop into pustules filled with live vaccine material, which could then be used to inoculate the next child in the chain. This human relay system ensured that fresh, potent vaccine would be available throughout the journey, no matter how long it took. Isabel Zendal Gomez, a nurse and supervisor from an orphanage in A Coruña, was recruited to care for the children during the voyage. She would be responsible for their health, education, and emotional well-being during what promised to be a difficult and dangerous journey. Zendal understood that she was not just accompanying a medical expedition, but caring for children who had been separated from everything familiar in their young lives. The expedition departed from A Coruña, Spain, in November 1803 aboard the ship Maria Pita. The vessel carried not just the orphans and medical staff, but also detailed instructions for vaccination procedures, translated into multiple languages by Balmis himself. The goal was not simply to transport the vaccine, but to establish sustainable vaccination programs in every territory they visited. The first stop was the Canary Islands, where the expedition successfully vaccinated local populations and established the first link in what would become a global vaccination network. From there, they sailed across the Atlantic to Puerto Rico, arriving in February 1804. The Caribbean colony became a testing ground for the procedures they would use throughout the Americas. The vaccination process itself was straightforward, but required careful timing. Material from an infected child's arm would be used to make small incisions in the arms of local volunteers. Within days, those newly vaccinated individuals would develop cowpox pustules, creating a new source of vaccine material. This allowed the expedition to vaccinate hundreds or thousands of people in each location while maintaining a supply of fresh vaccine for the next destination. From Puerto Rico, the expedition moved to Venezuela, where they achieved remarkable success. In just 2 months, they vaccinated approximately 12,000 people around Caracas and the surrounding region. The speed and efficiency of their work demonstrated that mass vaccination was not only possible, but could be implemented rapidly, even with the limited medical infrastructure of the early 19th century. The human cost of this medical triumph was borne primarily by the orphan boys who served as living vaccine carriers. These children endured the discomfort of repeated infections, the trauma of being separated from their homes, and the uncertainty of life aboard ship in an era when sea travel was dangerous and unpredictable. While none of the children died during the expedition, they all suffered from the deliberate infections that made the mission possible. Cuba became the next major destination where the expedition continued its pattern of mass vaccination and training local medical personnel. The Spanish authorities in each colony were instructed to maintain vaccination programs after the expedition moved on, creating a sustainable system that could protect future generations from smallpox outbreaks. The most ambitious portion of the journey began when the expedition reached Mexico in August 1804. From Mexico City, they traveled overland to Acapulco on the Pacific coast, where they faced a critical decision. The original group of Spanish orphans had already endured nearly a year of travel and repeated infections. For the Pacific crossing, Balmas recruited 25 Mexican boys to serve as new vaccine carriers for the longest and most dangerous portion of the expedition. If you want to understand how medical ethics evolved and why we now have strict protections for children in medical research, make sure to subscribe because we explore the dark history of medical experimentation and the fight for patient rights throughout history. The Pacific voyage tested the limits of 18th century navigation and medical logistics. The expedition sailed from Acapulco to the Philippines, a journey that took several months across the world's largest ocean. The Mexican children who served as vaccine carriers during this portion of the journey faced even greater challenges than their Spanish predecessors, traveling farther from home with less certainty about their eventual fate. In the Philippines, the expedition achieved one of its greatest successes, vaccinating approximately 20,000 people across the archipelago. The Spanish colonial administration embraced the vaccination program enthusiastically, recognizing that protecting the population from smallpox would strengthen their economic and political position in the region. The final destinations were Macau and Canton in China, where the expedition completed its global circuit. By the time they reached China, Balmas and his team had traveled for nearly 3 years, covering thousands of miles and vaccinating hundreds of thousands of people across 4 continents. The expedition returned to Spain in July 1806, having completed one of the most ambitious medical missions in human history. The numbers tell the story of the expedition's remarkable success. Conservative estimates suggest that over 200,000 people received vaccinations directly from the expedition, with many more receiving vaccines from the local programs they established. The expedition had created a global network of vaccination centers that continued operating long after the ships returned to Spain. Edward Jenner himself praised the expedition as an example of philanthropy so noble that it had few parallels in human history. The international medical community recognized that Balmas had solved one of the greatest logistical challenges in medicine, proving that complex medical interventions could be delivered on a global scale, even with the limited technology of the early 19th century. However, the ethical implications of using children as living vaccine carriers would be unthinkable by modern standards. The orphans had no meaningful choice in their participation, and their consent was never sought or considered relevant. The children were essentially conscripted into medical service, their bodies used as tools in a public health campaign, regardless of their personal wishes or well-being. The expedition also reflected the harsh realities of social class in early 19th century Spain. The children selected for the mission came exclusively from the poorest segments of society, their lives considered expendable in service of a greater good. Wealthy families would never have been asked to surrender their children for such a mission, highlighting the ways in which medical research has historically exploited vulnerable populations. Isabel Zendal's role in caring for the children has been largely overlooked by historical accounts, but her contribution was essential to the expedition's success. She provided the emotional support and practical care that kept the children healthy and cooperative throughout their ordeal. Zendal's work represents an early example of the nursing profession's commitment to patient care, even in the most challenging circumstances. The long-term impact of the expedition extended far beyond the immediate vaccination campaigns. The procedures developed by Balmis became the template for future public health initiatives, establishing principles of mass vaccination that are still used today. The expedition demonstrated that coordinated international action could address global health threats, a lesson that remains relevant in our modern era of pandemic diseases. The fate of the orphan boys after the expedition's conclusion remains largely unknown. Historical records suggest that some remained in the colonies where they had served as vaccine carriers, while others may have returned to Spain. Their contribution to medical history went largely unrecognized during their lifetimes, and most died in obscurity despite their role in saving countless lives. The scientific knowledge gained from the expedition helped establish vaccination as a standard medical practice throughout the Spanish Empire and beyond. The detailed records kept by Balmis and his team provided valuable data about vaccine effectiveness, storage, and distribution that influenced medical practice for generations. The expedition also demonstrated the importance of international cooperation in addressing health challenges. The success of the mission required coordination between Spanish colonial administrations, local medical personnel, and international partners in places like China and the Philippines. This collaborative approach became a model for future international health initiatives. Modern public health officials studying the expedition have noted both its remarkable achievements and its troubling methods. The mission succeeded in its primary goal of preventing smallpox deaths across the Spanish Empire, but it did so by exploiting vulnerable children in ways that would be considered criminal today. This tension between medical progress and ethical conduct continues to challenge public health professionals in the modern era. The expedition's legacy raises fundamental questions about the relationship between individual rights and collective welfare. While the vaccination campaign undoubtedly saved many lives, it did so at the expense of children who had no voice in their own treatment. These ethical dilemmas remain relevant as modern societies grapple with questions about mandatory vaccination, medical consent, and the limits of government authority in public health emergencies. The Royal Philanthropic Vaccine Expedition represents both the best and worst aspects of early modern medicine. It demonstrated humanity's capacity for innovative problem-solving and international cooperation in the face of devastating disease. At the same time, it revealed how easily medical progress could be pursued at the expense of the most vulnerable members of society. The last recorded mention of the orphan vaccine carriers appears in Spanish colonial records from 1807, noting the establishment of vaccination centers in remote provinces of the Americas. After that, the children who had carried salvation around the world simply vanish from history. No monuments commemorate their sacrifice, no medical textbooks mention their names. They succeeded in their mission so completely that smallpox would eventually be eradicated entirely, becoming the first disease in human history to be deliberately eliminated by vaccination. But the methods used to achieve this triumph would haunt medical ethics for centuries to come, raising a question that remains unanswered. When does the greater good justify sacrificing the innocent?